Chapter 17. A New Life. High above the ground, shrouded in turbulent wisps of fog, in the branches of an enormous tree, there was a woman. She was short and round-faced, but perhaps there was also a majesty to her, or at least there once had been. It was hard to see as she sat crumpled, slumping into her elegantly carven rocking-chair of old oak, her long brown locks hanging lank about her face in knotted clumps. For a moment she shifted slightly, and her eyes could be seen through the veil of unkempt hair. Set against deep bags of many sleepless nights, those eyes of shocking azure were an ocean overflowing. Kendra opened her eyes and realized her face was wet, cool in the gentle beams of sunshine on her cheeks. She wiped off the tears clumsily, still far away and half in a dream. It had been a sadness that was not her own, but was somehow familiar. But that was fading, and she felt strange. It took a few moments to realize that she was feeling good, very good. She couldn't remember waking up feeling so lively and full of well-being, ever. And as more memories came, she knew that that was impossible, and that she should certainly be dead. She pulled herself onto her elbows and looked down. The simple blouse was utterly ruined, slashed open at the belly and stained with caked-on blood. Stuffed under it was a thick wrapping of bandages, equally soiled. But there was no pain, no stiffness, no discomfort. She reached down tentatively to probe at the wound. "Kendra!" came a cry, shockingly loud, close at hand. She looked around wild-eyed, her heart beating forcefully. She was lying under a great thicket, a patchy roof of thorns and brambles hanging low over her, the morning sunlight leaking through in little splashes. Caleb and Maya were speaking furtively a little ways away, but Caleb now came hastily to her side, loping awkwardly. There was just barely enough height beneath the briar to walk, with a severe stoop. He looked terrible, as if he had been the one on his sick bed. His hair was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot and puffy, and it looked as if he'd not washed since tramping through the boggy fields of the Black House. "How do you feel?" he asked thickly. No, don't try to talk." Kendra smiled and laughed. She half expected the movement to catch at her wounds, but it came easily and freely. "Caleb, I'm fine," she insisted soothingly. "Or, I feel fine, anyway. Better than I would have thought." Curiously, she ran gentle fingers over the bandages, but could feel nothing through the wad of blood-encrusted fabric. Maya picked her way over with more composure. She could walk comfortably at her full, modest height, though her grin was warm and open. "I'm glad to hear it, Miss Kendra," she drawled. "This one over here was in quite a state after you got hurt." "Well, she could have died," Caleb cried indignantly, still much too loud. "When I found you, I thought you were already too far gone." His eyes swelled with emotion, and he changed tack abruptly. "You can't be so reckless. Throwing yourself at a monster like that. What if you'd—" His face screwed up, ruddy, and he turned away sharply. "I'm sorry I worried you," Kendra said with a gentle smile, and pulled him into a hug. After his initial resistance, he allowed it, and even let out a small, well-disguised sniffle. "What happened?" she asked Maya, who looked more up to talking. "It's like he says," she replied, a little throatily herself. "When we found you, you looked about 1 foot in the grave. After you cast down that damned devil, the dwarves up above started to go wild. They broke down into the tunnels, and we had to make a run for it, carrying you and all. It wasn't for a while that we could give you any sort of medical attention, and for a while there I thought it might be we were carrying a corpse. But when we got here, you were still hanging on like the most ornery sort of little creature you can imagine. We wrapped you up as best we could, put your insides back in you, but even then we didn't have much hope you'd pull through it. But I think we have ourselves a reasonable explanation now." Maya raised her eyebrows enigmatically. "I didn't take you for a woman of few words. Please tell me, what is it?" Caleb cleared his throat, pulling himself together again. "You may want to brace yourself somewhat," he said, still looking fairly distraught. "This may be a bit shocking." He gestured to the top of her head, and with a sense of disconcerted foreboding, she tentatively reached up. It did not take long. As she brushed her fingers through her dark tangle of dirty hair, her hands simultaneously touched two somethings that did not belong. She couldn't help it. She gasped and swore. How does one react to feeling through new appendages? Her hands explored the raised length of the thin, velvety skin that ran up the sides of her head and loosely trailed back. In turn, the long ears twitched and tingled under her palms, vividly feeling every callus. Kendra sat, utterly overwhelmed, her mind reeling. "The hair," she finally whispered. "The other familiar." Caleb nodded. "It seems likely that when you consumed its physical form, you inherited some aspect of it, something of its essence. Some kinds of magic pass in that way, through conquest. Unfortunately, all we can really offer is speculation, because frankly, nothing like this has ever happened before. No one has ever done permanent harm to one of the familiars. They've always regenerated, even from mortal wounds. Lucky for you, it would seem, it's just that quality that saved you." Kendra was half listening. Her ears seemed to be ringing, each slight noise echoing thunderously. No one ever managed to bring harm to a familiar until she came along and blunderingly, carelessly, ended their brotherhood. Her fingers slipped under the bandages, feeling the perfectly smooth, fresh skin of her stomach. "Lucky," she agreed hollowly. "It strikes me that you're being awful hard on yourself, Miss Kendra," Maya offered lightly. Kendra blinked out of her stupor. She had been lost in thought, sitting up to her nose in the sun-warmed waters of the pond. It was ethereally beautiful there in the little spring, not far from the thicket. Petals of wild rosebuds cascaded down in the mild breeze, a shower of pink and red passing into 1,000 tiny ripples all around them. It would have been easier, she thought, if her surroundings had been ugly. The dissonant rift between her physical and mental circumstances was painfully jarring. Presently she looked up, flashing a hasty smile. "I'm fine, Maya," she lied easily. Caleb had been nothing short of triumphant, passing between soaring exaltations, energetic scholarly musings, and nearly tearful celebration. All the while Kendra had remained unresponsive and subdued, sitting like a drawn bow. Finally, as the discomfort mounted, she had excused herself to wash up. To her faint surprise, Maya had invited herself along. But she would have felt churlish refusing, so together they went, splashing around quietly. She found that somehow it was easy to be there with Maya, even as her thoughts churned darkly. Perhaps it was knowing that the dwarf could not see exactly. Kendra removed her ruined clothes with only a little discomfort, while Maya began to wash in companionable silence. The stout, stony woman was vigorous and thorough in her scrubbing, removing ages of accumulated dirt and fungus. The skin that Kendra had taken for a nutty brown was revealed to be marble white, inhumanly pale, with a mess of short, wiry hair, the gray-blue of a softly stormy sky. Kendra watched, passing her fingers endlessly through her hair, along the unfamiliar ears, over the all-too-familiar scars mottled across her face. She was a little embarrassed to watch with such rapt curiosity, but it was alleviated by the fact that Maya seemed to be bare of sexual characteristics. Her body was smooth and doll-like. And, with a satisfied sigh, Maya turned imprecisely to Kendra's direction and broke her silence. She seemed not to acknowledge Kendra's hasty deception, continuing to rub away deeply ingrained smudges here and there as she made her way into a shady corner of the pool. Eventually she turned back, nodding pleasantly. "I may not know very much about humans, Miss Kendra, and especially not about you in particular. It might be said that it's not my business, but we'll be traveling together, at least for a little while, and I'd like to be sure that you're not suffering unduly. I'd also like to be sure that there's no untruths between us." She paused significantly, and finally, a bit red in the face, Kendra nodded her agreement. "I'm sorry," she started haltingly. "I'm not fine, exactly, but it's nothing to be worried about. That is to say, it doesn't really make any sense, and it definitely isn't the sort of thing that's worth your concern. I don't mean to bother you. You've already been very helpful and kind." Maya frowned mildly. "You're my companion, Miss Kendra. We make our go of it together. What's worth your worrying is worth at least a little worrying of my own." Absently, Maya ran her hand under the surface of the water, picking up a pinkish petal, rolling and feeling it between her fingers. "It might be good for you to talk about it, just a little. It might mean less worrying for the both of us," she offered gently. Kendra held a hand to her face and was silent for a while. "Why do I still have these burns?" she blurted out. Immediately she cringed at the childishness of it. "I'm very fortunate. I should be grateful, but I can't stop wondering how it is that I survived a brush with death without a scratch, got knitted up like I was never hurt, but my face is still mutilated." She clamped her jaw shut, eyes burning. Across the pond, Maya looked into the distance, pondering. "What's wrong with your face?" she finally asked. Kendra's mouth fell open. Then she gritted her teeth. "Please don't mock me," she said, trying to keep the harshness from her voice. "I know what I look like. You said no untruths, Maya? Well, fine. Don't pretend I don't look like a monster." Maya shook her head solemnly. "I meant no disrespect, Miss Kendra. It's just difficult for me to get a sense of that sort of fine detail on soft surfaces. I feel vibrations. I hear tiny movements in the air. I can tell you that there's a squirrel behind that tree over yonder. But it's easier with hard surfaces that conduct and bounce the sounds better. But the faces of flesh and blood, well, they can be a wee bit indistinct. Would you mind if I got a feel for it?" She extended her hands in askance, and Kendra, not without trepidation, moved through the water to where the dwarf was leaning against a little boulder stuck up out of the pond. As she bowed her head, she realized that it had been years since anyone else had touched her face. So distracted was she that when Maya's cold hands touched her, she gasped and trembled. But the hands were exceedingly gentle, stroking the rough curvature of her cheeks. The fingers ran through deep grooves, slack and shiny patches, places where the skin had healed badly, wrinkled and distorted over dead nerves. Kendra kneeled and tried not to cry. You've certainly been through a lot. Does it hurt?" Maya asked kindly. "Not usually," Kendra answered, a little muffled. It used to, but it's been healing for a long time now. It's all done now. Healed as much as it's going to. When I was very young, my mother pulled me out of a fire just in time to save me. Any longer, and there's no way I would have recovered. She gave her life for mine. I got lucky, again. Her throat burned, but she did not allow her voice to shake. So you see, it isn't something you should worry about. It's unfortunate, but I don't have any right to complain. I'm just being selfish. Miss Kendra, the dwarf said firmly, now tilting her face up. Just because you survived doesn't mean you don't get to grieve. You can't let that hurt fester inside you. It's poison. I spent years and years grieving my people. I guess I've been in mourning longer than you've walked this world of ours. I shut down entirely. I needed it. For a long time I was too hurt to do anything else but try and heal. I think even now I'm only just barely hanging together. Do you think I'm selfish, Kendra? No, of course not, Kendra said, pained. But that's not the same. You were just a bystander. There's nothing you could have done, and it didn't happen because of you. Kendra's face twisted grotesquely with loathing, but she pushed on. I've hurt people, Maya. I killed the Hair Familiar and left Adrian without a brother. My mother, she'd still be alive if... Kendra, you can't blame yourself for... Just as their voices rose to a climax, both of them fell suddenly silent. Somewhere, just within earshot of the women's sensitive hearing, a cry rang out. And after a moment, Kendra's jaw dropped, because she was certain, absolutely certain, that she knew that voice, one that she hadn't been wholly convinced she would ever hear again. Moira?